Hi again, everybody. It's Robin with GFAS, just jumping in to say welcome. We've had a number of people join us on the teleconference, so I just want to let you know we are going to be starting in just under 5 minutes. Your phone lines are muted. That's only to help with any distraction from background noise, and we get so many people on the phone at the same time. But if you have any questions, if you're having any technical problems, please feel free to type that into the chat box. I'll be happy to help you out. Barbara, I will let you know, no, you don't have to worry about that camera and microphone message. Your phones are muted and we shouldn't have the cameras up, so you should be able to just close that message. If we have any people that are on the phone line only because you're having trouble getting onto the internet portion, please feel free to send me an email to robin@sanctuaryfederation.org, and I can help you get signed in once we get started with the presentation. But please feel free to stay on the phone line while we do that. And I will chime in again in another minute or two as we have more people join the session. Thanks, everybody. Hi and welcome, everybody. It's Robin with GFAS, just jumping in again to welcome those of you that have just joined us on the teleconference. We're going to be starting in just a couple minutes, give everybody a chance to get signed in. As I mentioned before, your phone lines are muted. That's only to help with distraction from background noise when we get so many people on the phone at the same time. But if you have any questions or have any technical problems, please feel free to type that in the chat over on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll be happy to help you out. If you happen to be only on the phone line because you're having trouble getting onto the internet portion, please feel free to send me an email to robin@sanctuaryfederation.org and let me know what the issue is that you're having, and I will definitely help you out once we get the session started. But please feel free to stay on the phone line and listen while we do that. And as I said, we're going to be starting in just another minute or two. Thanks, everybody. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know we're going to have some more people signing in. And Paula, you should be fine. That message periodically comes up, but it's never created an issue. I've got it on my computer sometimes too, so you should be fine with that bandwidth message. Thank you. As we've got more people signing in, I just kind of quickly want to go over just some general housekeeping information. Because we've got 4 presenters today who've got a lot of great information, so I want to hand this over to them quickly. So again, for those of you that have just signed in, My name is Robin Mason. I'm with Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries. We want to thank you so much for attending the third of the Avian webinar series. As I mentioned before, your phone lines are muted. That's only to help with any distraction from background noise when we get a number of people on the phone at the same time. But if you have any technical questions, please feel free to type that into the chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. I'll be happy to help you out with that. If you are having issues getting onto the web portion, but you can hear me okay, go ahead and send me an email to robin@sanctuaryfederation.org. Let me know what's happening, and I'll help you out via email to get you signed in. But please feel free to stay on the line and listen while we're doing that. We are recording this session, and in the next couple of days, we will send a follow-up email with a survey and also a link to view this recording. So if you'd like to review any additional information, or if you have other of your members of your team who you think would benefit from this information, they can definitely feel free to take a look at that. We do appreciate your being here. Again, if you have any technical problems, please feel free to let me know. If you're having trouble hearing, you can type that into the chat also. If you have questions for the presenters during the presentation, please feel free to type those into the chat box also. We will pass those along periodically throughout the presentation, or the presenter may see it. If we don't get to your question right away, don't worry about it. We'll definitely make a note of it and pass it along. We should have some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So it is now my pleasure to go ahead and hand this over first to Kelly Heckman, the Executive Director of Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries. So you've got it, Kelly.
Great. Thank you, Robin. So as you mentioned, I am the Executive Director of GFAS. Oh my goodness. A globally recognized sanctuary accreditation body. Our mission is to help sanctuaries help animals, and one way that we support this mission is to reduce the causes and underlying issues that may result in animals needing sanctuary. And with this goal in mind, we've supported this three-part series on avian welfare with the focus on the animal shelter environment with several objectives in mind. We want to provide resources and advice for the short term in which you may have a bird in your care. We want to encourage those of you out there that run rescues and begin the accreditation process, which would give you a seal of approval as performing best practices of animal care and operations to your donors, grant makers, and the public at large. Also, we want to develop partnerships between you and the sheltering community and our accredited sanctuaries. And I'll talk about this again at the end of the session, but really you need to start thinking about developing these relationships now before you're responding to a crisis or an emergency situation. Then last, we wanted to ensure that the placement partnerships you are developing beyond our accredited sanctuaries are going to be servicing the bird's needs at large. And again, we'll talk more about that later on in this presentation. But now, briefly, I want to introduce Denise Kelly, President and co-founder of Avian Welfare Coalition, who has 30 years of experience with captive bird care. Denise has been the driving force in creating this webinar series and the complementary workshop series, which will continue with our next event at Tufts University on March 28th. So with that, again, brief introduction, I want to turn it over to Denise.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much, and welcome, everyone. I see some people returning, so I'm happy to have you all and some newcomers as well. This webinar on bird placement was probably the most difficult one to manage in this series, not only because of the unique considerations involved to ensure a successful bird placement, but also the many varying approaches to dealing with those issues. And from a personal perspective, I've always found bird placement the most daunting because it's the realization that the decisions that you make are going to impact the quality of life for that bird for years to come. And in the case of longer-lived species, that may even go beyond the initial placement that you make. So from the perspectives of the special challenges, there are plenty. For one thing, birds are captive wildlife. Most people are very familiar with dogs and cats, but are completely unfamiliar with birds. We also have to contend with some long-standing misconceptions and myths about the birds themselves, and to reverse years of outdated care standards, much of which have been promoted to serve the convenience of caretakers than to fulfill the true needs of the birds. And in fact, poor care standards are actually a contributing factor to the problem of birds becoming displaced. And those working on the front lines in avian rescue, animal sheltering, and in the veterinary practice are all too familiar with some of those devastating results. They're also a part of changing the paradigm for captive birds and to help raise the standards not only in the sheltering facilities that we focused on in parts 1 and 2, but also in homes and in all other living situations. We decided to reflect the diversity of those approaches by making this webinar a little bit more informal and by featuring 2 important voices, one from the avian sanctuary and one from the veterinary community. Both of our presenters are experienced with placing birds under 2 very different environments, and therefore they're bringing 2 unique perspectives on placement to this forum. And while each of the topics they'll be covering could probably warrant its own webinar series, and I think everybody would agree, we're going to try our best in the time we've allotted to provide some perspectives on facilitating the bird placement process, how it differs from cats and dogs, how to evaluate potential adopters and placement partners, and most importantly, how to educate adopters so in turn they'll have a better and much more realistic understanding of what it takes to be a bird guardian, and hopefully to inspire them to provide the kind of care that will enable the birds in their homes to thrive. Lastly, this session is intended to provide some basic principles and guidelines for the placement of exotic birds. Obviously, there are as many exceptions as the different personalities of the birds themselves, so there is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to birds. And everyone must use their informed discretion to evaluate their individual situation based on the unique conditions and circumstances, always with the top priority being guided by each bird's individual needs. With this in mind, I'd like to go through the people who have helped make this series. Special thanks to Lorelei Tibbetts and Karen Windsor, our presenters, to Kelly Heckman and to Robin, who's been put together this PowerPoint presentation, and thank you very much, Robin. And I'd also like to thank Patty Finch for her inspiration and support on this. Of course, to all of our people who contributed photos, and to Dr. Anthony Pilney, who helped with part 1 of this webinar series. And if you haven't listened to that, please do. Part 2 was with Lorelei Tibbetts. So we hope with that, I am going to turn this over to Kelly Heckman.
Thanks, Denise. So before I hand it over to the speakers, I want to kind of step back and think more broadly about the needs of birds and really all captive animals. So you probably have come across the 5 freedoms in your work with companion animals. They're the principles by which all animals should have in captivity, not only in shelters, but anywhere, zoos, farms, and even our homes. So with it, they include freedom from hunger, thirst, or malnutrition, disease, injury, freedom from physical or thermal discomfort, fear, distress, or other negative psychological states, and ensure that they carry out normal forms of behavior, which for birds includes flight and social bonding, among many other things. So for us, it is important to think about the unique needs of birds and what needs to be done in order to guarantee they receive the 5 freedoms. So you should look into ensure that the birds that come into your care receive a lifetime of care that follow these 5 rules. And using that as a guideline, the first 2 parts of this series, we gave you some insight into providing for the nutritional requirements, keeping the environments free of disease, giving them appropriate space. But today, as Denise mentioned, we're going to be discussing the prospects of birds finding new homes after they've left your facilities. So either through adoption or potentially placement partners. So how can we ensure that the 5 freedoms are maintained at your facilities, but also after they've left? So you'll need to assess the animal, and this is kind of an overview of what's going to happen today. Assess the animal. So are they adoptable? Should they go to a sanctuary? How do you choose adopters? And what would be the ideal setting for this unique bird? Education for the potential adopters of the unique needs of birds at large and maybe for that individual animal, and what you can do to support those needs and help them support those needs. And then again, developing placement partnerships. So do the partners that you develop share your desire to give birds those 5 freedoms? So for some of you, this is maybe the first time you've really been thinking about avian adoption, and you don't currently have an avian adoption program per se. So if you're interested in moving in that direction, you'll need to go through the exercise of generating an applicant screening process, organizing home checks, ensuring potential adopter has no plans of breeding, which would only contribute to this issue of homeless birds, setting up a system of ongoing support, and of course pulling the necessary contracts together to make it all legal. And a lot of this you might have in your arsenal given your work with dogs and cats, but again, it's worth considering the unique needs of birds. So to discuss these issues that a shelter faces in finding placement for birds, we have 2 excellent speakers for you today, as Denise mentioned. First, we have Karen Windsor, who is the Executive Director of a GFAS-accredited sanctuary, Foster Parrots, in Rhode Island. She and her husband, Mark Johnson, launched Foster Parrots, which has become a premier avian rescue and sanctuary, and also serves to educate the community about avian issues and building collaborative relationships to support avian welfare. And so I really appreciate Karen for coming and helping give this presentation today. We also have Lorelei Tibbetts, who is the practice manager at New York City's only exotic pet hospital, the Center for Avian and Exotic Medicine. And if you've been following the series, you know that Lorelei was a speaker for our 2nd webinar, and we are just thrilled that she could return and give us more insight from her experience. So with that, I will let Lorelei take it. I believe Lorelei is going to launch this to start a discussion about how birds require unique placement considerations.
I am. Thank you so much. I wanted to start by saying I'm so happy that so many of you are watching this and listening to this, because as someone who works in veterinary medicine, you know, we work with so many birds, and you wouldn't think that it may be something I would be terribly experienced in, but if I could tell you how many times a week I get emails from people, clients, non-clients, almost on a daily basis, from people who are looking to either find homes for their birds, find permanent sanctuary, rehome, for all the myriad of reasons we're going to talk about. You know, it's really mind-boggling. It was something I didn't expect when I first started getting into veterinary medicine. I didn't really think I would be part of a huge network of adoption for birds and for other exotic animals too. So, you know, it's a great joy to do it. I'm happy to be a part of it, but more importantly, it's kind of mandatory. It's something that I think anybody who's in veterinary medicine, if any of you out there are, should really be educated about and involved in. So, moving on, we're going to talk a lot about some of the unique placement considerations of birds, and they really are unique in that they're very different from dogs and cats. These birds are they're not captive animals, or perhaps shouldn't be captive animals, in that they have so many intact natural behaviors carried over from their innate instincts from being wild. I think a lot of people are starting to be aware of the noise issue. And, you know, people come to me all the time, well, I'm not interested in getting a bird. Is there one that's not so loud or that's not noisy? And the answer is no. I remember my first time in Costa Rica, being woken up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning before the sun is up, by the, you know, screaming calls and flocking and foraging of the parrots. And it's amazing to hear. It's what they're supposed to do. So, you know, some species maybe aren't quite as loud as others, but the bottom line is anyone who's looking to adopt a bird has to be prepared for a lot of noise. Mess and destruction is another major problem for birds. They, as much as they are caged animals, they throw things out of their cage. They poop instead of once or twice a day, like a dog or a cat, 20, 30 times a day, depending on the kind of bird. They release a lot of feather dander, not just feathers, but dander that creates, depending on this kind of bird, an enormous amount of mess in the home. I think there's something very different than dogs and cats as well. And we're going to talk a little more about that, but a lot of birds bite out of just normal fear response, and that can be interpreted as something that negative, whereas it's really just a normal part of what they do. And then bonding preferences. Some birds just either don't prefer to be bonded with people, they're bonded to other birds, or they are not acclimated or used to being with people. And sometimes it's something different. They only like, you know, women with blonde hair or men with mustaches. It's very particular, and that's a very strange and unique issue for birds. Feather destruction and self-mutilation is a major problem for certain species in particular. And it's hard because a lot of people desire to have birds as pets because they're so incredibly beautiful. And then when something happens, like this adorable African gray on the right image here, for those of you who can see it, a lot of them, once they're in captivity, start doing things like pulling their feathers out or even hurting themselves and damaging their skin. So this can be very undesirable for birds. And as far as male and female, this is a very interesting fact that most birds are not sexually dimorphic to the human eye, meaning we can't tell in most species which one's male or female. And that can make it very difficult when you're talking about placement considerations. Somebody just posted a little comment here that I thought I'd mention about there are quiet birds in need of homes, domestic pigeons, especially, and doves are close seconds, and that they don't bite. You know, I would only disagree in that I think doves can be very noisy, and they have kind of a constant cooing noises and things that I've had clients become very quite annoyed by and not want. And they do bite as well. I just would be really careful when adopting these birds out. They're all different. I've been bitten by many pigeons, and certainly it's not as bad as a macaw bite, but it can happen. So just be careful when you're describing birds' behavior to potential adopters. We want to be honest about, you know, what they can or can't expect. So temperament and adoptability, absolutely, they cannot be evaluated on the same scale as dogs and cats. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it can be very normal for them to become what we would consider aggressive, lunging, beak open, attacking. Some birds even will fly if they're able to what looks like harm a person, but really it's a part of their natural defensive behavior, and this is a normal part of how they react. It's not something they've been bred to do, such as, you know, certain dog species that might have been, you know, bred to be aggressive for various reasons. And they respond really differently when they're in a shelter setting and with different caretakers. They might really find certain, they might react to certain people differently. They might find some people, tall people, might be more threatening to them, and they might be more fearful and aggressive. Like I mentioned, different sexes, male or female, to birds can, for whatever reason, be intimidating to them or preferable to them. And then there's seasonal behavior changes. Many, many times birds will be different depending on their reproductive seasonal state. Certain times of the year, birds will become really kind of almost crazed hormonally. They're looking to be more, make a family, make babies, and they might be more cage protective or territorial. So there's a lot of things to consider depending on, the time of year that you're looking to place these birds. So spaying and neutering is very tricky. Doing these surgeries is something that we really only do on a really medically required basis. It's very complicated, very difficult, both spaying and neutering of birds. And we really wouldn't do it preventatively. Unfortunately, medicine hasn't advanced to that state yet. And unintentional breeding is a bad consequence of this. You get these cute little lovebirds in, and they are, happy to be in pairs, males and females, and happy to make many, many babies. So that can be really frustrating because it just propagates the problem of too many birds in the pet trade. So really important is screening out breeders. I think a lot of people think it's fun or beautiful and a miracle of life, and there really isn't much cuter than a baby parrot. But our responsibility really needs to be with people who are not looking to create more unwanted birds or birds that are difficult to place, especially with these larger parrots. There's really no reason for us to be trying to make the problem worse. One of the things that I used to say to people is, oh, we're looking to find our forever home for these birds. And over the years, I've kind of stopped saying that because it's really not accurate. Whether depending on the age of the bird and the species of the bird, but there are instances where people just can't care for the birds anymore, whether it's they become indigent or elderly. People have changes in their lifestyle where they maybe can no longer care for birds. So it's important to take all of these things into account when you're looking to adopt out these birds. They have really long lifespans, some of them. They have these really complicated social needs. So we don't want to set people up for necessarily thinking, oh, this bird's going to be in your home forever. You should be setting them up for as long as you possibly can and prepare for what happens at the next stage. And I think Karen's going to be talking a bit about that later on as well. And then as far as veterinary care, this is something I, of course, talk about with clients all the time because there's nothing more frustrating than when I adopt a pet out to a client and then 6 months or a year later they come back and their pet has a problem, an illness or trauma or whatever, and they don't have the money to care for the pet at that point. So I think it's really important to address this. We shouldn't really be adopting pets to people who can't afford veterinary care. It's very basic needs that these animals need to have. Pets are a luxury, in my opinion. I don't think that people who can't afford proper medical care should have them, and I have no problem telling people that. And I think as far as veterinary care for birds, it should be mandatory. And yes, it is expensive. Avian specialists are just that, specialists. They've gone out of their way to dedicate their lives and their professions to birds, and it can certainly cost more to pay for that kind of an expertise. Somebody just mentioned veterinary care is experimental at times and can be hard to find. Yeah, depending on where you live, that can be really frustrating. If there aren't any specialists nearby, we can talk about later. I think I have another opportunity to discuss different ways of finding avian vets that are maybe not specialists but savvy in veterinary medicine for birds, and that can be frustrating if there isn't someone near you for sure. So trying to decide whether a bird is ready to go to a home or should be in a kind of permanent sanctuary can be a tough call, especially for shelter workers who maybe aren't that familiar with birds. You have to try really hard to get to know birds' body language and try to understand what they're telling you. There are some birds that are really gregarious and they love people. They want to sit on your shoulder. They want to communicate with you by, whether it's just eye contact and talking and verbalizing, or physically. They might actually be hand-tamed and want to actually be bonded to people. And sometimes this is very obvious, sometimes not. There are some birds who are the complete opposite. They're just terrified of people. You walk in the room and they back up. They're hiding behind things in their enclosures, just really, really terrified. And it may not mean that these birds have been abused. It may not mean that they've been, injured or have had trauma with people. It might just be their personality. Maybe they came from a situation where they were only with other birds. And then the question is, are they adoptable? Should birds like that go to a home with people? And that really just depends on the situation. It depends on the potential adopters and whether or not they're going to be able to handle that kind of a situation and provide the proper social needs for these birds under those conditions. And we're definitely going to touch on that more later. It's really important to allow the birds to decide for themselves. I think a lot of times in a shelter situation, these birds it's going to be kind of obvious whether or not they're willing to and happy to socialize with people, or if they're just going to be happier being with other of their own species. And I think one of the things we have to be really careful about is not forcing them in a situation they're not comfortable with. Conversely, a bird might not be comfortable being with another bird. Maybe they've never seen another bird before and don't want to be with another bird. So it's important to recognize what the bird wants. And then, of course, you're going to come across birds that have serious behavioral or medical issues, particularly, like I mentioned before, they might have feather destructive behavior or self-mutilation problems. And these might not be something that a typical new bird owner is able to handle. And you really need to identify your resources. And of course, veterinary resources are great. We have a lot of clients who are more comfortable with birds that might have, different behavioral or medical conditions and have more experience handling them. Shelters and places, sanctuaries also might have more resources for kind of bird savvy potential adopters, and having those resources are going to be very important. Somebody just posted a quick question about what defines a bird as being, quote, exotic. For us in the veterinary field, we treat, the name of our practice is the Center for Avian and Exotic Medicine. And basically, it's any pet, because we don't really treat wildlife where I am, but pet that is not a dog or a cat. They're considered exotic if they're not traditional domestic species. So with that, the next slide, we're going to move on, and Karen's going to take over for a little bit and bounce back and forth.
Okay. Well, now we've got birds in the shelter situation, and we've got to now figure out how to get them out, hopefully. The adoption evaluation process is particularly important in regards to parrots because the care requirements for parrots are so complex and are not necessarily well understood by the average adoption applicant. To the greatest extent possible, we are trying to break that cycle of perpetual rehoming that so many parrots experience. Through the adopter evaluation process, we hope to decrease instances where we're placing parrots in exactly the same kinds of situations they're coming from. Some of the questions we need to ask are, what are the applicant's motivations or expectations? Are they realistic? Are they in the best interest of the parrot? What is the experience level of the adopter, and what species of parrot is likely to be a good fit? To what extent does the applicant have the ability to meet the needs of a parrot? Do they have the time? Do they have the money? In short, the evaluation process is the tool we use to gauge the strengths and weaknesses of an adoption applicant, determine how much support the applicant is going to need, and weed out poorly suited applicants. Prior parrot care experience is definitely not always necessary. In fact, so much of the information about parrot care that's been disseminated over the last 2 to 3 decades has been proven to actually be harmful to parrots. We'd rather have someone tell us that they have no experience but are willing to learn and are open to guidance. The parrot will teach the guardian about parrots. What is most valuable in an adoption applicant is compassion, empathy, commitment, and willingness to learn. Denise, did you have a comment about this photo?
Yes, I did have a comment. Just as an example, the bird in this picture was actually a bird who lived in a basement for 30 years without the company of another bird and was never handled. That was his second home, so it's likely that this bird, Cece, is a lot older than 30. When the adopter took the bird to the vet, when she first got the bird, he was nearly on death's door, huddled on the cage floor, unable to perch, and could barely breathe. The vet diagnosed that this bird had heart problems, parasites, and a respiratory infection. Obviously, the bird hadn't been seen by a vet in years or possibly had never been to one. This photo was taken 6 months later. And as you can see, this transformation of this bird is just amazing. I've met him, and he is just wonderful. And it's a classic example of when you find the right dedicated adopter, it does happen. And the resilience of a bird that has lived like that to adapt to a new life. So I just hope this provides a little inspiration for people to say, well, if the bird seems unadoptable, well, it really can turn around for them with the right adopter. Next.
Okay, it's Lorelei.
Lorelei, you're back on.
So, continuing this evaluating potential placement topic, social support not being optional, it's essential. It can't be overstated. When I'm interviewing potential adopters, I talk to them at length about what's their home situation like? How often are they home? What are their work schedules like? I want an idea of how much attention and how much interaction they're going to be able to have with these birds, because birds really should not be alone in a cage all day long. It's quite cruel. They certainly should have companionship with other birds. It's funny, last summer, we had a veterinary student studying with us from Sweden, and she said that in Sweden they have a law that you actually cannot purchase exotic animals singly. They will only, by law, sell 2 a pair at a time. Not just birds, guinea pigs, well, maybe not hamsters because they eat each other, but other animals as well. I thought that was really amazing. They're recognizing the need of these animals to have companionship. They are flocking birds. We mentioned here parakeets, cockatiels, canaries, finches, lovebirds, but really all birds live in some sort of a social network in the wild. And they really should not be adopted out as single pets. Homes in which parrots of any species will spend all or most of the day alone represent a poor placement situation. I mean, that's really as basic as it gets. If the bird is going to be alone, this just isn't going to be a good place for that bird. And I really think it's important that you guys are well in tune with that. For birds in particular. Regarding health and wellness, of course, the ability to provide species-specific nutritional needs, very, very important. We are going to talk about diet later on, but it's well beyond just filling a bowl of seeds. I think that's very outdated, old-fashioned. We don't just dump seed in a dish and give it to birds anymore. And we're going to talk about that later. And as I mentioned before, access to and the ability to afford veterinary care. Somebody posted a question asking, he says an annual exam for a dog seems to run between $200 and $300, depending on vaccines, testing, et cetera. How much is a typical bird exam? Because I think, I did mention it can be very expensive. Well, the good news about bird exams is the most important thing to do is have them examined. So it's really just the cost of the exam, which depending on where you live can be anywhere probably from $35 or $40 up to, we charge $115 in New York City where we practice. We don't do vaccines for birds. We don't do, usually flea and tick prevention and things like that. So we do often recommend testing, not maybe on an annual basis, but every few years to ensure the overall health of the pet. So the actual yearly cost of bringing your bird to the vet isn't that high compared to dogs and cats. But when they get sick, yes, it can be very expensive. We need a lot of specialized equipment and a lot of specialized training in order to be able to work with these animals. So that's when it can be a little bit, cost prohibitive, I think, for some people. regarding, how to find veterinary care for birds, I think a great resource for people who don't know or aren't aware of bird savvy veterinarians would be to go to, number one, the ABVP, which is the American Board of Veterinary Practitioners website. They are the governing board for board certified vets. And then there's the AAV, which is the Association of Avian Veterinarians. These are not board certified vets necessarily, but they are veterinarians who have a very special interest in birds. They're a member of this organization, so they are going to continuing education, and they've taken it upon themselves to be part of a group that's more interested in birds. So this would also be a good opportunity for people to find a maybe bird savvy vet that's not certified if there isn't a board certified vet in your area. Somebody mentioned here on the comments section the initial visit to get baseline values can make a difference in diagnosing when something goes wrong. I think what she's talking about, and I couldn't agree more, would be the first time you ever bring your bird to a vet. We like to call it a post-purchase or post-adoption exam. We very often will recommend post-purchase testing for infectious disease to get a baseline of what's going on. Cost for something like that, again, I'm in New York City, things probably cost a bit more here. That can certainly be anywhere outside of the $100 exam fee, could be anywhere from $200 to $400 for post-purchase or post-adoption testing, just to give you guys a basic idea. And the two links I mentioned, if somebody's asking, were AAV.org, that's the Association of Avian Veterinarians, and the other is ABVP, the American Board of Veterinary Practitioners. Those are great resources for locations of avian vets around the country and actually internationally. So when you have an application, when you're trying to find good homes for these birds, there are some things that you can ask to help kind of let them know and find out if they have any potential dangers in the home. And it's important that you guys all understand what a lot of those risks and dangers are. So here's some. Potentially dangerous predatory animals, dogs, cats, any of these animals that like to eat birds certainly could be dangerous. Not all of them are, and it can be a little bit tricky here because some dogs and cats actually live very well in homes with parrots and birds. But this is something that needs to be addressed, and you need to figure this out before placing a bird in a potentially dangerous environment. Teflon and other nonstick surfaces that are coated, with the PTFEs, when they get overheated, they emit this very highly toxic fumes that kills birds. This is not a myth. I have seen this in practice many times over the years, unfortunately, and I think it's something to just emphasize again and again. It's not any kind of nonstick pan that you accidentally leave in the oven or burn something on the stove can kill your bird. So be very, very careful about that. Self-cleaning ovens and silicone oven mats as well can be very dangerous because of those same kinds of fumes that are emitted. Tobacco smoke, meaning if people are smoking, whatever it is, pipes or cigarettes at home, paint fumes, particularly oil-based paint, and burning wood. Somebody mentioned the burning wood example in their comment section here. If you have a wood-burning stove, a fireplace, anything that releases smoke, basically, potentially in your home, could be really, really dangerous. And depending on the kind of wood you're burning, too, I'm not real familiar with, I've seen it, I don't have a fireplace here, but I've seen in the stores they sell those starter logs. There's all kinds of chemicals put on those. I don't know what that releases when you burn them in the home, so just be really careful about that. Somebody wants me to mention it's not always when things get overheated. She knew someone who lost a Goffin cockatoo to a bread maker with nonstick coating. That's really scary. I've always been under the impression it was when it was overheated. Maybe the bread baker was on for a very extended period amount of time. I don't know, or who knows, but that's really tragic. So yeah, my recommendation to people regardless is just don't use it. There's a lot of other wonderful products out there other than non-stick cookware to cook with. There's really no need for any of that. And then escape paths, direct access to the outdoors, windows without screens. These are all really bad ideas. If there's a chance that if your bird is out and flying around the home, which hopefully they are trying to get exercise, you have screens on your windows, screens on your doors, and there's no way that they could potentially get lost outside. Similar to other animals, plug-in air fresheners and scented candles can be dangerous, but for birds it's just a little bit worse because they have really, really sensitive respiratory tracts and a whole system of air sacs that makes airborne toxins much more dangerous to them. So anytime you're using these air fresheners, scented candles, anything that can release toxins, you're going to really put your bird at risk. And this is something that all potential bird owners, at your shelters, you just need a list of things that they shouldn't have in their homes. And when you're, again, this is meant for when you're having your application process, these are the questions that you should ask so that you can have a conversation with them about it. And try to get a feel. Are they the kind of people who, no matter what you say, they're going to smoke at home with the bird? They're not willing to give up their non-stick cookware. That's fine. They can have that lifestyle, but they shouldn't have a bird. They should potentially consider adopting another kind of an animal. There's certainly a lot of other dangers in the home, and we are going to touch base on those later on in the talk. So get ready. We're gonna scare these people even more with all the potential dangers.
I would also like to mention that we do offer an avian adoption package on our website, which includes an evaluation form and application at avianwelfare.org/shelters.
Okay, we're going to talk about long-term care. It's important that any potential parrot guardian understands what the term long-lived means. In terms of parrot guardianship, we are talking about an animal who, if well cared for, will almost inevitably outlive its guardian's ability to continue care. If you're a young 30-year-old person who adopts a 5-year-old Amazon, 50 years down the road, you're going to be at the end of your life and your ability to care for a parrot. But your Amazon's got several decades of life left. It's not uncommon for Amazons to live well past their 60s and 70s. Same holds true for other larger parrot species like macaws. Even healthy, well-cared-for cockatiels should be living into their mid-30s. Consequently, when a parrot is adopted into a family, it's going to take several generations of people in the same family to care for the parrot throughout its life. So parrots, they're messy, they're loud, they're destructive, territorial, aggressive, demanding. Despite all of these issues, the most typical reasons we hear for parrot relinquishment are not so much about bird behavior as they are about the changes and events in people's lives. Divorce, marriage, birth of a baby, children growing up and moving away, residential problems like apartment restrictions, residential moves or loss of a residence. Health issues are huge, and many of these are directly related to the presence of the bird in the home. Allergies are not uncommon, and serious lung issues like COPD, asthma, or birder's lung are all too common. And of course, just like we talked about, many parrots lose their homes when their guardians grow too old to continue care or they die. It's important that an adoption applicant seriously thinks through the variety of potential life changes or events that may impact their ability or willingness to continue caring for a parrot. Estate planning is important to ensure the continued care of any animal beyond our own life. In the case of a parrot with a potential lifespan of 30, 50, or 80 years, this is most critical. Furthermore, there are fewer people or agencies equipped to assume the care of a parrot, so pre-planning is essential. Adopters must be informed that this is not only a part of the reality of parrot guardianship, but also a part of the expense of parrot guardianship. Many people assume, and this is my favorite, many people assume that their children will step up and take over the care of their parrot. Well, guess what? The children have grown up witnessing the level of commitment required to keep a parrot. They don't want the parrot. Steps that need to be taken in the estate planning process include designating a guardian or several willing guardians, and the operative word here is willing. And because humans can be unreliable, it's a good idea to make sure there's a backup plan. Alternatively, many people prefer the security and permanence of a sanctuary for their bird's retirement. If that is the case, it's critically important that people visit any facility where they are considering placing their bird and are comfortable with the arrangements and quality of care that will be delivered. If possible, financial considerations should be included in one's estate planning. In the event that a sanctuary has been chosen, a financial arrangement will be expected, and it can be high. Estate planning for one's parrot or any kind of pet should be pursued with the assistance of an attorney or a formal will or pet trust. Laws surrounding pet trusts and financial settlements for pets vary from state to state, so it's advisable to research the facts and plan accordingly. Lastly, it is important to make sure that friends and family all know exactly what arrangements have been made for the parrot and that they can easily access contact information for whomever will assume care for the bird. The concept of estate planning should be discussed with any potential parrot adopter or really adopters of any animal. It would be a good idea to include estate planning information and guides in every adoption packet for birds, for dogs, for cats. There's nothing sadder than an animal that is left behind when it's died. Okay, utilizing foster homes. Any parrot entering an unfamiliar shelter situation is going to be pretty freaked out, but some parrots are better equipped to settle in and go with the flow than others. A shelter needs to be able to evaluate the individual needs of each parrot coming into the system, as well as its own ability to meet those needs. Having access to a foster home situation for certain parrots who might need a more quiet setting or specialized care can be a good thing. An interim foster home situation might be appropriate for a parrot if a shelter lacks space or quarantine accommodations for parrots. Phobic or nervous parrots requiring medical attention or socialization training may all benefit from a foster home situation. Oh, God, there are so many unique challenges surrounding finding good quality placement situations for parrots. As shelter professionals, it is our job not just to get animals out of our facilities, but also to make sure we are placing them into good homes with informed adopters. Our role as educators and advocates for the birds and animals we place is one of our most important functions. In order to properly educate, we ourselves need to be educated, and we need to pass on what we know. As we work to place parrots and properly educate adopters, one of the biggest challenges we face is to dispel so many widely accepted myths and misconceptions about parrot care and effectively raise the bar in regards to standards of care for parrots kept as pets. It's important to recognize that many pet industry standards were established solely for the purpose of marketing and selling the birds and were designed to appeal to consumers, not to benefit the parrots. Over the last 20 to 30 years, we've learned a lot about the true social and psychological nature of parrots. As shelters, rescue organizations, and veterinarians, our fundamental responsibility is to the well-being and welfare of the animals we care for. Therefore, we have the responsibility and the obligation to educate bird placement partners, clients, and adopters. A tiger born in captivity is no less wild than a tiger born in the jungle. Everybody knows this, but we don't seem to understand the correlation when it applies to parrots who are, in every respect, wild animals. It's when we take this wild animal and try to squeeze it into a domestic mold that we end up disappointed in the animal who cannot possibly fulfill our expectations, and we set ourselves up for adoption failure. We do not advocate keeping wild animals as pets, but the reality is that people are going to continue to keep parrots. If this is the case, then we need to learn to embrace the wild and not only anticipate and accommodate natural wild behaviors, but also value them as the unique attributes of the extraordinary animal who we are privileged to have in our lives. Myth. The myth alert. Parrots should be purchased or adopted as single pets in order to ensure the bond between the parrot and the human. It's really difficult to decide which parrot care myth has actually been the most harmful to parrots, but the single parrot alone in a cage standard is certainly right up there with the top most destructive standards in aviculture. Parrots are social animals and are wired to be connected on the same level as elephants, dolphins, and primates, including humans. They are capable of feeling profound loneliness, and they are subject to the psychological trauma as a result of chronic social isolation. When a parrot is adopted into a human home, that family must be prepared to be the flock and to fulfill that parrot socially and in a meaningful way every single day. If a human family cannot be present for a greater part of each day, then parrots should be adopted in pairs or small groups. Social support is not optional, it is essential. Parrots who are well socialized with humans can love their avian partners as well as their human guardians and will thrive with the attention of both. One of the leading causes of adoption failure is the lack of adequate social support. This results in parrots who act out and guardians who are unable to handle the guilt of the loneliness they have imposed upon their bird. I can't tell you how many times when I have asked an adoption applicant how much one-on-one time they will be able to give their parrot, they proudly say, my parrot will get 1 hour of attention every single day. It's wow. If someone were to walk into a shelter to adopt a dog and they told the shelter manager that they intended to provide the dog with 1 full hour of out-of-crate time every single day, that person would never be allowed to adopt a dog. It is unclear why anyone would think this would be an acceptable way to keep a parrot. Parrots are territorial by nature and they can certainly love their cages, but the difference between a cage that is a safe place and a haven and a cage that is a prison is as simple as an open door. When we're evaluating an adopter to determine what they have to offer a parrot, or when we're educating an adopter to enhance what they have to offer, we need to start thinking in terms of avian environments, not just cages. A cage should not be the environment, it should be a part of the environment. And there are so many creative ways to enhance a parrot's living experience within the home. Natural branches, ropes, swings, hanging playframes can be incorporated into a setting to increase real estate and opportunities for play and exploration. A spare room or a porch or garage could be converted into dedicated bird space. We have some nice examples of things that people have done. In this little series of photos, these are lovely examples of a spare room that's been converted into dedicated bird space. And please note the middle photo that shows the screen door. It's been installed, and this is a great way to keep a bird room connected to the rest of the household. They can see in, people, can see out, and this is just a wonderful, sunny, beautiful setting for birds. Here, someone has converted their garage into a bird room. Notice that in this photo and in the previous photos, the cages are included in the environments, but the doors are open. And birds do like to have the choice to be in the cage or out of the cage. And choice is one thing that we rob captive birds of. They so often don't have any choices. Let's see, the photo on the right here, this is large enough to be its own environment. It's a really nice cage, and we've always said, buy the biggest cage you can afford, which, this is a nice example. They can get pretty pricey, but you notice that this is outfitted nicely with a variety of toys. In the photo of the bird room on the right, it's important to note that these macaws are provided with the opportunity to be up high. And another well-accepted myth of parrot keeping is that parrots should be kept lower than the guardian's head. And, parrots were born for the skies and they're oriented for height. And this myth of keeping the parrots lower is really more about keeping them subordinate than really serving their needs. Here's a beautiful example of someone going the extra mile to provide outdoor space for their birds. This is a panel caging system. It's just beautiful. And it's important to know that sunshine and fresh air benefit the health of parrots just as much as people. And sunshine is something that a lot of parrots never even see. In these photos, we see how someone has used a carport frame to construct an outdoor aviary. And look how happy those macaws are. That's almost what they look like in the wild, and I've seen them in the wild. So, kind of to close, what I have to talk about, when we're talking about raising accepted standards of care for parrots, these are really the kinds of standards we need to be reaching for. Many people may not be able to achieve standards like this, but many people should not have a parrot. I don't think the idea is to make sure that everyone can find a way to have a parrot. I think the idea is to honestly evaluate what we have to offer, and if we can't meet a new standard that really serves the fundamental needs of birds in captivity, we need to rethink our choice of a pet. Cats are great pets. People should think about cats.
So,
Lorelei?
This is Lorelei again. I wanted, there's a bunch of really good questions, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of them I thought I wanted to address before moving on is if there's a bonded pair of birds that are destructive to one another, such as plucking behaviors, should they stay together? My answer to that would be absolutely. They're a bonded pair. I would never dream of separating them. But what needs to happen is their needs need to be addressed. There's a reason that happens. That is not a normal behavior that you see in the wild. You don't ever see birds that are plucked like that in the wild. And it's a behavior problem that's based on one of their needs not being met, whether it's dietary, medical, space, foraging. There are many, many things, and it's just something that a veterinarian and or a behaviorist needs to address. So the answer, in my opinion, would be absolutely they need to stay together. I wouldn't break that pair up. I don't know if Karen or anyone else has something to add there, but I think that's important. Somebody else mentioned also had a question about why the emphasis on Teflon toxicity. Wouldn't it be aren't there more deaths caused by dogs and cats hurting birds in captivity than Teflon? I don't know the statistics. What I think is important is we're trying to find things. I think everybody knows that dogs and cats are probably not safe to have around birds because they're going to want to eat them. That's normal. But they probably don't all know that non-stick coatings are toxic to birds. So the reason we emphasize it is because it's such a different thing. It's kind of common sense. Don't put the cat and the bird together. But it's not necessarily common sense not to overcook your eggs in the morning. So just to clarify.
Well, interestingly, over the years, we have received calls from people who have lost their birds to other family pets, but we have received far more calls from people who are devastated to have killed their pets with Teflon. We absolutely will not consider adopting a bird into a home where Teflon is kept or used. It's our number one.
I agree with that for sure. So moving on to some kind of fun things I think are important and fun are that people who are looking to adopt birds should be encouraged to make it enjoyable both for the birds and for themselves. For me, part of the joy of sharing my lives with these animals is being able to make them happy and give them lots to do. These are just some images of different, kinds of ways to get birds to forage and look for toys, look for treats, different perches and sizes of perches, different textures of things for them to chew on, enrichment environments outside of the bird cage so that they can really, have more things to do than, again, just sitting in a cage. These are all images of birds either with a friend or doing something more interesting than just sitting in a cage. And I think it should be encouraged to people, and they should be reminded that this should be enjoyable, and what's enjoyable for the bird is going to be enjoyable for them as well, as they're sharing their experiences together.
I just like to say that those examples that we showed under environmental enhancements are things that people could actually do in an apartment, because we realize if you're living in a Manhattan apartment or a condominium, you may not be able to build an aviary, but you can set up something, hang things from the ceiling, or create a little, like this one in the center with the plexiglass place stand. Do something in an apartment and still, get that bird something outside the cage.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm right now at my apartment in New York City looking at my birds, and they're all over my apartment staring at me in front of different environments. And it's really important to know that if you don't have to have a huge home, there are ways of creating environments in small spaces that are really fun and enjoyable for birds. Another fabulous alert. All parrot needs is a bowl of seed mix and a cup of water. Well, I touched on this earlier, something we talk a lot about at my veterinary hospital. These standard commercial seed-based diets are really, really deficient. There's just not enough vitamin A, calcium. There's so many nutritional elements that are missing, and it's not enough to do anymore. We know better. We've learned over the last several decades that we've really been increasing pet bird ownership, and we should really be teaching people how to do a better job. So as a general rule, what's healthy for humans is healthy for parrots. There are very few things that we eat that they can't. Avocado is one, and certainly junk food, chocolate and caffeine and things like that. It shouldn't be fed to parrots, but really they're omnivorous, like we are. Their diets should consist of no more than 10% seed. And if you are going to be feeding seeds, it should be human quality, not from a pet store, but seeds. And it doesn't have to just be sunflower seeds. It can be other kinds of seeds, including things like well, if you go to your health food store and you go to the bins, there's a lot of wonderful different seeds and things that you can get and give your birds as treats. But again, 10% is a good starting point. So what should make up the other 90%? It should be, similar to people, unprocessed foods, unprocessed produce, lots of green leafy vegetables, omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acid rich foods. You can certainly incorporate things like nuts and walnuts, all things like that are healthy for people are going to be healthy for birds. I mentioned vitamin A earlier because that's one of the vitamins that has traditionally been found to be very deficient in a seed mix diet that can cause birds a lot of problems with the respiratory tract, skin, eyes, overall health. So things that are orange and yellow, vegetables like sweet potatoes, pumpkin, yams, peppers, things like that are really important to enrich a bird's diet. And then, of course, we do now have commercially made pellets for birds. There's a lot of different brands. This is really what birds should be eating. They should have a commercially made pellet. There are, of the different varieties, there are some that, in my opinion, are better than others. I always try to find ones that are organic and look at the ingredients. These days, people are looking at the ingredients of the processed foods they buy for themselves. So if you're going to be feeding processed foods to your birds, including a pelleted diet, look at the ingredients in the back. Do you want it to be completely made of soy and corn? Probably not. Look and see and find one that suits your own, what you're choosing to feed your birds. And remember that variety definitely is the spice of life. You can cook for your birds. You can make it fun. They can eat spices. They can eat seasonings. It's something that I can't encourage enough. Again, as part of what I said before, it should be fun. People, if you want to have a bird in your life, you should also want to have fun cooking experiences and preparing things for your birds. It's part of what makes it enjoyable. And if that doesn't make it, if that's not something you like, you're probably not going to want to share your home with a bird, or you shouldn't be sharing your home with a bird. There are definitely some unique considerations to think about. Some species have different requirements. For example, large macaws living in South America, the majority of their diet are these very fatty, rich palm nuts and things like that unfortunately we don't have here growing in our backyard. But you might want to consider tailoring certain species diets based on the region that they're from and what their physiology is meant for them to be eating, by giving them, my green-winged macaw, I try really hard to get her a lot of the different nuts, macadamia nuts and things that are available to us while she's here, unfortunately, in my home. Reproduction and age is also an issue as far as just common sense things. If you have a bird that's laying eggs, birds like chickens will lay unfertilized eggs whether or not there's a male present. So during that time, they're going to need some enhanced nutrition with calcium and protein and things like that. And elderly birds as well, like with other animals and people, you might want to watch the amount of protein that you're giving your bird and increase some of the other important vitamins and things that as we age are more important, fatty acids and things like that. I want to talk a little about flight for birds. And, I think we've mentioned earlier a few times about how important it is. And it is one of those things that it's another myth, I think, that birds don't need to fly. So, number one, flight impairment means vulnerability. These birds use flight as a means not only of getting around, but it's how they escape. It's how they, can retreat when they're scared. And when they're not able to do that, it really, really affects them psychologically. When birds fledge, when they're in the nest and they're learning to fly, it is a completely essential part of their developmental stage. Nothing is more obvious to me working in veterinary medicine than when I see a young bird who has phobic or serious self-confidence issues. 99% of the time, if I do a little back research and I find out that they never learned to fly. They were clipped at the pet store or at the breeders before they ever learned to fly. And these birds are so frequently, they have a lot of different phobic, nervous behaviors that plague them throughout their life because they miss this really important confidence building aspect of their development. And then, of course, flying is so important cardiovascularly for these birds. How else are they going to exercise? I mean, they literally become perch potatoes sitting on a perch all day if they're not able to exercise. And sure, okay, walking and climbing is okay, but most people aren't putting their birds on stairmasters in the cages. I haven't seen that invented yet. Maybe someday it will, but until then, what's a better form of exercise than flight? Well, none. There really isn't. So everything from muscle conditioning to joint strength, metabolism, reproductive health, exercising / regularly. It's so important medically and behaviorally. Myth alert, depriving a bird from flight doesn't matter to the bird and keeps them safe. This is one I've heard many, many times over the years. I don't know that we can say what does or doesn't matter to a bird. I don't know what would make us think it wouldn't matter to a bird. They were designed by nature. All of a sudden, we're taking that ability away from them. I don't know why one would assume that wouldn't matter to them, but okay. And keeping them safe, I honestly believe it's quite the opposite of that. It's a fundamental function, and as I mentioned before, physically and psychologically, it's really, really important.
Lorelei?
Yeah. Yes. Hello? Somebody just said my name.
Lorelei, we can't hear you. I don't know.
I haven't
seen you go on the call.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
I can hear Lorelei.
I can hear her.
Okay, then maybe it's just me.
I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to continue talking. If people can't hear me, post something. I haven't changed anything.
Okay, I can hear you now. You sound better then.
You were breaking up, but I think, maybe talk more directly into the microphone.
I don't know, maybe something happened. A parrot was drowning me out. Oh, gosh, I think it wasn't. They're being really good right now. Okay. I'll hold it up a little. I hope this is better. Sorry, guys. So what I was talking about was more about flight and how important it is for as a fundamental function, both physically and psychologically for them. So a lot of times people come to us at the veterinary hospital and they want their bird's wings clipped. And the first thing I always ask them is, why? Why do you want your bird's wings clipped? And they say, oh, well, because, I was just told that that's what we need. It's so they bond with me better. Well, okay, I guess in some instances I see why they recommend that, especially if you have a little parakeet that is terrified and isn't used to being out near people. Sure, if you take its ability to get away from you away and you force to stick it on your hand, that may be, quote, bonding. But in my opinion, that is not the way that you're going to endear your pet to you, by forcing them to be with you when they're absolutely horrified and terrified. We know better now. There are better ways of bonding with your pet bird, or maybe you shouldn't bond with your pet bird. Think outside the box, and I tell this to clients all the time. I don't put it delicately. I just tell it like it is. If your bird, and if you don't have the time or ability to do what's needed to bond with your bird properly, because that can be a long process, then maybe your bird just needs another bird to be naturally bonded to. And I start introducing that an idea as a way that might be more appropriate for them. And then safety is the other thing they say. Well, I just wanted to be safe because I have a dog or a cat, and I don't want them to, fly into the dog's mouth or something. I hear things like this all the time. Or, I don't want the bird flying out the window. Well, it seems ridiculous to me. If you don't want the bird flying out the window, close the window, get a screen. And it's quite the opposite. If there's other predatory animals in the home, clipping the bird's wings will make them way more vulnerable. You want to have the bird able to escape. You want that bird to be an expert flyer so that they can be completely away from these animals. In the wild, that's what their wings are for, evading problems, getting away from problems. So sure, I've seen every, worst case scenario, and I am going to talk about some of the dangers in the home again, where birds fly into trouble. But more often than not, if you keep the potential hazards away, flight is the risks far outweigh, or the benefits far outweigh the risks of keeping your birds able to fly. Looks like you guys can hear me better now, so good. So adopter education moving forward, and outdoor safety is again really important thing that we talk about. Birds do enjoy and benefit from sunshine and fresh air. However, taking safety measures to prevent escape and keep them outside is essential. So, UV light from the sun, we're finding this to be more and more important for birds' medical health, both for calcium absorption as well as their psychological well-being. Direct sunlight is really, really crucial for them. And of course, fresh air is as well. Anytime that you're kept in a home, we go stir crazy when we're kept inside. I think a lot of that has to do with air quality, and you just want fresh air. So getting your birds outside can be enormously beneficial, but you've got to be safe about it. Screened-in porches are wonderful. There were some great pictures that Karen was showing you earlier of ways to have your birds access to outside safely. If you bring your bird outside, and again, this is my opinion and our stance, is to always have your bird in a carrier or travel cage. It can be a carrier or travel cage that is made of mesh or wire or metal, so that they can get the benefits of the fresh air and UV light. It doesn't have to just be a cardboard box or a big plastic box where they actually can't see or anything like that. I love when I see people in New York City with their parrots outside, basically in a cage, a small carrying cage outside. It's really great to see people doing that for their birds. They do make harnesses for birds, mostly the larger sized ones, and I think these can be great. The problem is it's a lot of times birds don't tolerate it very well. It's hard getting your bird in them. They are able to take them off. So having a situation where you might need to train your bird to be able to have a harness on it might be a way to start. I wouldn't just towel your bird, force a harness on it and bring it outside. You want to know how they're going to react to it before, and that can be a little bit complicated, but certainly that is a way of getting them outside. And then there's the free flying issue. There are a lot of advocates out there for people who free fly their birds. I've known clients of ours who do it. There's obvious safety issues there. I have seen the people who train their birds and are, formal bird trainers who take their birds outside and have for years and years and free fly them, and then for whatever reason, a windy day, maybe it's a seasonal thing, the bird's a little bit more territorial, or who knows what's going on in the bird's mind on that day, but they lose them, and it's crushing. So it's not something that I would even remotely ever recommend to anyone, no matter their level of expertise. Of course, there's legal issues as well. Releasing non-native species is illegal. None of these birds are native anywhere in the United States that I'm aware of. And as far as best left to professionals, sure, there are some zoological parks that have professional bird trainers, and it is glorious to see these birds free flying and on command and all of that. As far as your own personal ethical beliefs with it, as far as training birds, I'll leave that up to you. But as far as our recommendations and what I think you guys should be recommending to potential adopters is don't do it. It's way too complicated, too many dangers, and I would strongly recommend not doing that. Somebody mentioned, speaking of the illegality of releasing non-natives, why is pigeon racing legal, or is it? I'm not really sure about that. That's a really good question. I have to do a little research on that, because certainly pigeon racing and people keep pigeons who are technically non-native all over New York City. It's quite popular. People love it as a sport, and I don't see those people getting arrested. So I don't know. It's a really good question. I'm aware of that. So on to some safety matters. Flighted birds are especially prone to these potential hazards in the home. So again, I do think birds should be able to fly, but people should just be made aware. And I unfortunately have seen pretty much all of these birds that have a collision with ceiling fans, wood-burning fireplaces, or any other open flames. Again, it's not just the smoke or the toxins we worry about, but it's also that birds are attracted to sparkly, shiny things, and they might just be curious enough to fly into something like this. Doors that are open, even just glass windows. I've seen, obviously, birds we all know fly into windows. Unfortunately, tends to be the wild birds that fly into windows of buildings and things, but it is a really big problem for mirrors as well. And then any kind of an open tub of water, a flushing toilet, again, it's swirling around, it's making a fun noise. Birds might want to see what's happening in there. I have seen birds that have been severely injured from flying into, soups on the stove, or even a steaming coffee grounds. I saw a parakeet once get severely injured and burned from, it just thought it was really cool looking, and maybe it was a nest because it was like brown and smoking. I don't know. He flew right into it, and that was a big problem. So, you just have to be careful and aware of these dangers. They seem like common sense, but again, a listing of them on a adoption page might be a good idea. And then you can just keep birds safe by preventing these issues in the home. So population control is obviously really important. In the event that a bonded pair of birds begins nesting, and they're in your shelter program, how do you handle that? It is seasonal, although there are some birds who kind of do this year-round. Certain species of birds are just more likely to lay eggs and nest kind of all year, regardless of what their natural season may be. Certainly, doves and pigeons are very, very prolific. Parakeets, cockatiels, birds like that kind of can go all year round if you're not careful. Some ways to eliminate this are to get rid of places they like to lay eggs. I have seen birds really go crazy anywhere. Cardboard boxes are a particularly fun place for birds to make nests. They sell those little, I think they call them happy huts, little cozy things for birds. And it's really cute when a bird goes into these little fuzzy houses, but a lot of times they interpret this as a nest. Remember that the vast majority of parrots in the wild don't sleep in a nest. They go in there to create babies. They only do that when they're in the breeding season. They don't generally build a nest and then go in there every night to sleep. So I think it's important to realize that when people give your bird what you think is just a little place for it to sleep, they could interpret that as a place to build a nest. They definitely perceive their cages as their territory. Sometimes they even perceive that as a nest itself, and they'll just start building things within the cage, which, again, can be really fun and cute to watch, but just be aware that nesting behavior might turn into actual egg laying. And it is a conversation to have with potential pet owners as well, that by excessively stimulating them can kind of throw them into egg laying cycles. Certain birds like cockatoos, they want to be held and petted and scratched. And I don't think what people realize, if they're not, well versed in bird behavior, is that that's all that allopreening and the face scratching and the kissing and the rubbing and the touching. It's interpreted by the bird as sexual behavior, and that can really stimulate them to start creating a little family. So in the event that does happen, we encourage our clients to pull and replace the eggs. Obviously, we don't want them to be breeding and making more and more babies. So once you see an egg has been produced, rather than removing it completely, we recommend that you replace it with a fake egg, or you can take the egg, and some people have a problem with this, but you can put it in the freezer, you can boil it and then give it back, whatever you're comfortable with. But the reason we put them back is because if you don't, the bird will just generally keep laying and laying. It's in there. They want to, they're programmed to reproduce. They're wild animals, and they're just going to keep laying eggs if they don't think they're there. You want to let them have the eggs for the full extent of their gestation, which can vary by species. It tends to usually be about 3 weeks for the average bird. You want to leave fake eggs or eggs that have been, damaged so that they're not fertile in the nest for about 3 weeks, depending on the species. And of course, educating your potential adopters about reproductive disease and chronic problems is important. That in and of itself could be a very long lecture we're not going to go into, but reproductive diseases can include what we call egg binding. I think that might be the most common one to make people aware of, that especially if their nutrition isn't good, especially if they don't have access to full spectrum or sunlight, they are susceptible to not being able to lay eggs normally, and they can actually get stuck inside of them and cause serious medical emergency or death. And of course, they get cancers and polyps and cysts and all things that other animals get reproductively, and people should be aware that that can happen. And the more we encourage them to become reproductively active, the more you're going to see a lot of these problems. Somebody just mentioned on the comments here that except Quakers who do roost. As far as I know, that's the only one that does nest year-round. They build these huge communities, and they will sleep in their nests without thinking of it as reproductive time. And that's actually why sometimes Quaker parrots are one of the most cage territorial parrots I've ever met, because they really do think of it as their nest / sleeping habitat / territory, and you better not go near it or they're going to rip your arm off. Once they're away from their nest, they're perfectly lovely creatures, but when they're near that cage or nest, sometimes they're quite vicious. So, Karen, you're next.
I'm next.
No, I think
Kelly.
Yeah, it's me, Kelly. Well, I just want to, I'm going to wrap this up for the most part, but I want to really thank Karen and Lorelei for all the really amazing information that they've provided so far. And, for the majority of it, we've been talking about the steps and information that would benefit the birds and their new caregivers in providing them with the best welfare possible. But I'm sure we all have experience where adoption may not always be the only way to go. So some of you may not have avian adoption programs at your shelters, or you find that you're at capacity for space and you can't really take on a new group of animals at all, including birds, or that you do the assessment and you find out that the bird just isn't really a good candidate for home placement. So, what I wanted to, bring up again, I mentioned it earlier, that we need to set up some alternative options and do this ahead of time. So you don't want to end up with, 10 birds coming in your facility and then not having the communication with the right organizations that could help you with the placement. So this is, getting back to developing partnerships and building relationships with other organizations in support of the welfare of any birds that might come into your facility. And so, as this is one of our main objectives for GFAS in coming up with this webinar series, we want to really support the development of these connections. And really, most importantly, making those connections with organizations that have a comparable standard of high quality of care. And at the core of this, we get back to those 5 freedoms. So we want to ensure the birds have the capacity to live the rest of their lives with these guiding principles in mind. So GFAS has done a lot of thinking about how to ensure the animals in captivity are well provided for, not only from the direct care perspective, but just as important to us is that the actual organization is healthy as well, one that can provide a sustainable and is available for the lifetime of the care for that animal, even if the lifetime is expected to be decades. So, we include safety, financial management, and governance standards as well. And for those sanctuaries and rescues that go through our accreditation process, we ensure these freedoms by setting guidelines for the housing requirements, such as space guidelines, physical facilities, nutritional requirements, and the like, and making sure that their social needs are considered as well. But again, to emphasize some of the discussion that's already taken place, we want to make sure that the animals that enter into these captive environments are not being allowed to breed. And the GFAS standard says that we don't really believe that any animal should end up in a captive environment. So unless it's part of a formal reintroduction program that would invest animals into their native habitat, we would restrict any kind of breeding. So when you're looking for placement partners, of course, we recommend our own accredited organizations first, and I would, highly recommend reaching out to those that might be in your area. However, there's only so many that have gone through the rigorous application process to become a GFAS accredited sanctuary, and so it's prudent to expand upon your network to other facilities that might, be able to facilitate your placement needs. So some possible examples include, parrot rescue sanctuary and placement clubs, veterinarians and clinics, bird club adoption programs, animal shelters, humane societies, foster homes, and animal boarding facilities. Some of these might be short-term support, so something like the foster homes and animal boarding, but that's going to fulfill needs that, if you're at a short-term space restriction, this might help you get to a point where you can still support the needs of the animals, but ultimately get them back to your own facilities. Then others are going to be more supportive for the long term. And, those, again, are going to be the sanctuaries that, looking at potential adoption programs. And it's these that, are then the long-term care that, is really super critical that you start developing, because, it's going to be a significant undertaking on, the part of your partner if you go to them for support in, helping get these animals adopted or placed. But given that, we want to be careful about who we're reaching out to. And so, we want to, again, ensure that we're all following the same guidelines of care, ensuring the 5 freedoms. And so there's, a couple warning signs that I'm going to have here, but, in general, you want to be smart about and diligent when you're selecting your partners. So for one, you want to look at the history of the organization, and one aspect is what is their reputation for selling birds, not the adoption, but for profit. Specifically, Parrots have a perceived value of that facilities might become interested in taking them off your hand, so that they might be able to sell them in order to make a profit. Obviously, that's a big no-no. So ask them about their adoption program. What criteria for adopters do they have? What kind of fee structure do they put in? What is a contingency plan if an adoption does not work out? Recommendations for long-term care if, once the original owner passes away, and those things that, we've talked about already. Another issue, again, is breeding. And, we want to make sure that we're not emphasizing a problem by allowing breeding to continue. So, just like dogs and cats. So we want to be diligent when we're creating these partners, looking for, again, suspicious activity. Are they known for selling birds or giving birds away to potential breeders? Do they actually sell animals to fund their operations? Are they the type that are just collecting birds and letting them breed due to a lack of diligence? And some of the options that Lorelei was just talking about, population control. So these are all the kind of things that, when you're creating partnerships, although very, very important, you want to make sure that you're following along the same philosophical guidelines that you've established as, an organization yourself. And of course, GFAS is here to be a reference for you. There's a few things I want to point out that exist on our website, sanctuaryfederation.org. First of all, we have a list of all of our accredited sanctuaries. Some of them are specifically avian, but I also want to point out that we have a lot of different groups that have multi-species that they care for, which would then also include avian species. So go see if there's any in your area and introduce yourself. Not only are they potentially good for placement, but, they're going to, obviously Karen's been this amazing wealth of information. They might just be able to be someone, if you have that relationship, to go to when you just need some advice. Of course, we also have our standards of care. We actually have 4 different groups of birds that have individual standards for their needs. Birds of prey, aquatic birds, arboreal perching birds, and ground feeding birds. Then another objective of us having this, and I apologize if the dog is snoring. I tried to move and she followed me. So the last thing I want to say is, we obviously want to make sure that if you are a rescue organization, we highly recommend you going through our accreditation process. Some of the basic criteria, if you're wondering if your organization qualifies, some of the issues that, we look first to is, are you a 501c3 organization or, some other government, if you're not based in the U.S., other governmentally recognized nonprofit status. Again, you have a no breeding policy, except in the cases of reintroduction of native species. You demonstrate ethical acquisition and disposition of your animals, again, kind of discouraging the buying and selling and the pet trade of these animals. And then, again, direct contact is really based on the needs of the animal. want to discourage things that would be potentially harmful. But, if an animal is, it does provide a social benefit, then, we'll certainly encourage that. So with that little spiel, I just want to hand it back to Denise. And before I do that, I want to really give all of the speakers that were part of this 3-part series a very warm thank you. Lorelei and Karen today, Dr. Anthony Pilney from the first presentation, and then of course I want to give a thank you to Denise for really being the cheerleader and organizer for this, what I hope is a long-term amazing resource for us all.
Yes.
So I'm going to
let
Denise give us the final word.
The final word is that the parrots need you. Birds that are in the shelters are really suffering a major upheaval of their lives, and we need to be there for them. And sometimes it just takes observation and time on the part of the shelter to determine what's best for these birds. We talk about adoptable, unadoptable. I think time and observation leads you to make the right choice. And I'm so appreciative that everyone contributed to this, and for everyone who's attended, please share all of the 3 webinar links with any of your colleagues that are caring for birds, and those of you who are doing avian work, please investigate becoming an accredited facility. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. And did you have one more slide you wanted to at least pull up while we do any final comments?
Well,
perfect.
Yes, just our disclaimer. We want to make sure that everyone uses this information to the best of their informed discretion to evaluate what is appropriate for their particular situation. And thank you very much, everyone. And any last words, Kelly?
Well, I will jump in and I will mention that I know we got some questions. I don't think we got to all of them. Thank you all so much for your questions. We're kind of over time at this point, so unless any of the presenters saw any questions they want to make sure to touch on right now, Denise will make sure and she'll go through the chat and we'll pass along any questions that weren't responded to, and we'll get your response via email. So
yes, we will do that. Right.
Please keep that in mind. So if anybody has any closing comments they want to make, I just want to again reiterate what Kelly said. Thank you so much. A huge thank you to all of the presenters and to Denise. You all did a great job in getting such very nice comments in the chat. So thank you all very much.
Robin, you're being too modest. Trust me, if it wasn't for Robin, I would have, It was fantastic working with you.
Not a problem, not a problem. And if anybody has...
I'm sorry. I feel compelled to just very quickly address Elizabeth Young, who is so concerned about pigeons and doves. And we have actually at our sanctuary taken in quite a lot of these. Sometimes they come in the form of they're actually wild pigeons who we have actually re-released them because they came from the wild. We evaluate them, and sometimes they're not eligible for release, and we do keep a little mixed aviary, and we've got some pigeons and doves. But we've gotten to know some pigeons, and they're absolutely fabulous animals, and they are social and intelligent and funny and crazy, and so people underestimate these animals. They're awesome, and they deserve our consideration as well.
Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Karen. I agree.
Any other comments, Kelly or Lorelei or Karen or Denise, before we end the presentation?
I don't think so. I think we're good. But again, a warm thank you to everybody involved, and I think this is a very valuable thing that we'll be available for a long time so that people will be able to continue to reference it. So you'll be able to
Great.
find it on our website for a long time.
And thank you, Kelly. We will get, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, in the next couple of days, we'll send out a survey and a link to this recording as soon as it's up and ready. So thank you again, everybody, for attending and for your time today.
Okay.
Thank
Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.